To the American observer, Canada is the polite neighbor to the north. It is the land of stability, safety, universal health care, and a banking system that famously avoided the worst of the 2008 financial crisis. For decades, the global narrative has been that Canada is the simple, sane version of the United States, a place where regulations work, where the middle class is secure, and where slow, steady growth is the rule of law. But that narrative is dead. The Canada you think you know no longer exists. If you strip away the branding and look at the cold, hard data, Canada has transformed into something unrecognizable. It is no longer a productive G7 economy. It is a massive speculative real estate hedge fund attached to a resource extraction colony, all masquerading as a sovereign nation. We are currently watching the slow-motion detonation of the largest housing bubble in human history relative to the size of an economy. The numbers coming out of Toronto and Vancouver make the 2008 U.S. subprime crisis look like a minor market correction. The leverage is higher, the incomes are lower, and the systemic rot goes deeper. When the U.S. housing market crashed in 2008, it nearly took down the global financial system. But the U.S. had a diversified economy. It had tech, it had manufacturing, it had a global reserve currency. Canada has none of these safety nets. Its economy has become completely cannibalized by the housing market. Real estate is now the largest component of Canada's GDP, eclipsing oil and gas, manufacturing, and technology combined. The Canadian dream has mutated into a nightmare where the only way to build wealth is to buy a house, and the only way to buy a house is to already have wealth. This is the story of how a stable nation became addicted to cheap debt, how it sold its future to launder global capital, and why the inevitable crash will be worse than 2008. To understand the magnitude of the disaster, we have to look at the numbers that the Canadian government is terrified to talk about. In 2008, at the absolute peak of the American housing bubble, right before Lehman Brothers collapsed and the world caught fire, U.S. household debt hit roughly 100% of GDP. That was the saturation point. That was the level of debt that broke the back of the American consumer. Today, Canadian household debt is over 107% of GDP. In fact, for most of the last few years, Canada has held the dishonorable title of having the most indebted households in the G7. But the debt isn't the only problem, it's the price. In the United States, the price-to-income ratio, how many years of salary it takes to buy a home, peaked at around 5x in 2008. In Canada today, the national average is over 8x. In Toronto and Vancouver, it is over 12x. This is mathematical insanity. It implies that for a typical person to buy a typical home, they must pledge their entire gross income for more than a decade. Assuming they don't eat, pay taxes, or wear clothes. Since that is impossible, the gap is filled with debt. Massive, unpayable mountains of debt. So, how did the sensible country end up here? It started ironically with Canada's success. During the 2008 global financial crisis, Canada's banks didn't fail. They were regulated more strictly than American banks, and they didn't have the same exposure to toxic subprime derivatives. The Canadian government patted itself on the back. They declared that the Canadian model was superior. But this success bred complacency. Because the economy didn't crash, house prices didn't reset. While American real estate went on a 30% discount, allowing a new generation to buy in, Canadian real estate just kept going up. The Bank of Canada, following the U.S. Federal Reserve, dropped interest rates to rock bottom to stimulate the economy. But because Canada didn't have a crash, that cheap money didn't go into rebuilding. It went into speculating. Canadians looked at the housing market and saw a line that only went up. They saw their neighbors getting rich by simply sitting in their living rooms. A cultural mania took hold. Housing stopped being viewed as shelter and started being viewed as a risk-free asset class with infinite returns. Investment capital that should have gone into starting businesses, building factories, or researching new technologies was sucked into the black hole of residential real estate. Why would you risk investing in a tech startup that might fail when you could buy a condo in Toronto and watch it appreciate by 15% a year, leveraged 5-to-1? This killed Canadian productivity. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, recently released a report projecting the growth of advanced economies over the next decade. Canada was dead last. Not near the bottom, dead last. Why? Because a country cannot get rich by selling houses to each other back and forth. That doesn't create value, it just inflates asset prices. But the domestic mania is only half the story. The darker side of the Canadian housing bubble is where the money came from. For the last 15 years, Canada has effectively hung a open for business sign for the world's illicit capital. This is known as the Vancouver model. International crime syndicates, corrupt officials, and tax evaders realized that Canada had a loophole. You could buy real estate through shell companies with almost zero transparency. You didn't have to say who the real owner was. You could show up with bags of cash at a casino, wash it, and buy a luxury penthouse. This phenomenon, known as snowwashing, turned Canadian real estate into a global piggy bank for the world's dirty money. Reports estimate that billions of dollars were laundered through British Columbia and Ontario real estate alone. This massive influx of artificial demand disconnected local housing prices from local incomes. A dentist in Vancouver wasn't competing with another dentist for a home. He was competing with a shadowy shell company funded by capital flight from overseas. The government knew this was happening. Intelligence agencies warned them, but the government did nothing. Why? Because the influx of foreign money was propping up the GDP numbers. It made the politicians look like economic geniuses. The real estate transfer taxes filled the government coffers. The construction jobs kept the unemployment numbers low. They became addicted to the drug of foreign capital. And when the prices got too high for locals, the government didn't try to lower prices. They tried to increase the demand even further to keep the Ponzi scheme going. This brings us to the demographic shock. In recent years, the Canadian government has ramped up immigration to levels that are unprecedented in the developed world. We are talking about population growth rates of roughly 3% per year. This is faster than many developing nations in Africa. The government argues this is necessary to fill labor shortages. But the economic reality is that this is a demand-side stimulus for the housing market. When you bring in 1 million people in a year, but you only build 200,000 housing units, the price of shelter has to go up. It is basic supply and demand. This policy has crushed the rental market. Rents in major cities have skyrocketed, forcing young people and immigrants into overcrowding. We are now seeing slumlord listings in Toronto where people are renting out half a bed or a mattress in a kitchen for hundreds of dollars a month. We are seeing the explosion of tent encampments, dubbed Trudeau towns, in every major city park. This is the third worldification of a G7 nation. But the government cannot stop the population flow because if the demand drops, the housing bubble bursts. And if the housing bubble bursts, the banking system goes with it. This is the scary part. The banks. In the US, there are thousands of banks. In Canada, there's an oligopoly known as the Big Five. These banks control almost everything. They are massive. They are protected by the government. And they are exposed to the housing market to a terrifying degree. For years, these banks handed out mortgages like candy. But unlike the US in 2008, where the loans were ninja loans, no income, no job, Canadian borrowers generally had jobs. The problem wasn't the borrower's employment. The problem was the structure of the loan. In Canada, you cannot lock in a 30-year fixed rate like you can in the US. The standard mortgage in Canada is a 5-year term. Every 5 years, you have to renegotiate your loan at the current interest rate. This means that the entire Canadian housing market is effectively on a gigantic adjustable rate timer. When interest rates were near zero during the pandemic, Canadians gorged on debt. They took out massive mortgages to buy million-dollar shacks, betting that rates would stay low forever. Variable rate mortgages became incredibly popular because they were slightly cheaper than fixed rates. Then inflation hit. The Bank of Canada was forced to raise interest rates from 0.25% to 5% in record time. This was the trigger event. For those on variable rate mortgages, the pain was instant. But here is where the Canadian banks did something truly devious to hide the crisis. It is called negative amortization. As interest rates rose, the monthly interest payments on these variable mortgages skyrocketed. They rose so much that the borrower's fixed monthly payment wasn't even covering the interest, let alone paying down the principal debt. In a sane system, the bank would call the borrower and say, "Oh, no, you need to pay more money." This is called hitting the trigger rate. But the banks knew that if they did this, hundreds of thousands of Canadians would default instantly. So the banks allowed the borrowers to extend their amortization periods. Instead of paying off the house in 25 years, the math shifted. Suddenly, borrowers were on track to pay off their homes in 50 years, then 70 years. In some cases, we saw amortization periods extend to 90 years. Let that sink in. A 90-year mortgage. You will be dead, your children will be dead, and the house will still not be paid off. This is extend and pretend. The banks and the regulators allowed this to happen to prevent a wave of foreclosures. They kicked the can down the road. But the can is getting heavier, and the road is running out. The wall of renewals is approaching. Starting in 2025 and 2026, the millions of Canadians who locked in fixed rates at 1.5% or 2% during the pandemic will have to renew. They will be facing rates of 4%, 5%, or higher. Their monthly payments will jump by 30%, 40%, or even 50%. This is a payment shock that the average household cannot absorb. Canadian wages have not kept up with inflation. The cost of living, food, energy, taxes is crushing the middle class. There is no extra money in the budget to absorb a $500 increase in the monthly mortgage payment. We are already seeing the cracks. The private lending market, the shadow banks, is starting to freeze. Condo investors in Toronto are bleeding cash. For the first time in years, more investors are selling properties than buying them. They are realizing that being a landlord does not make sense when the rent does not cover the mortgage and the property value is falling. The condo market in Toronto is the epicenter of the crash. There are tens of thousands of units coming to market. Tiny shoebox in the sky. Apartments that were built for investors, not families. Nobody wants them. The inventory is piling up. The sales have collapsed. Prices are starting to slide. And when real estate prices fall in a highly leveraged economy, it creates a wealth effect in reverse. When people feel rich because their house went up in value, they spend money. They buy cars, they go on vacations, they renovate. This drives the economy. But when house prices fall, people feel poor. They stop spending. The economy contracts, businesses fire workers, unemployment rises. And when unemployment rises, people can't pay their mortgages. This creates a feedback loop of doom. More forced selling leads to lower prices, which leads to more unemployment, which leads to more forced selling. This is the cycle Canada is entering now. The government is desperate to stop it. They are trying everything. They are extending amortization limits for first-time buyers. They are buying up mortgage bonds. They are practically begging the central bank to cut rates. But the Bank of Canada is trapped. This is the prisoner's dilemma of Canadian economics. If they cut interest rates aggressively to save the housing market, they risk devaluing the Canadian dollar. The loonie is already weak. If the spread between U.S. interest rates and Canadian interest rates gets too wide, capital will flee Canada. The currency will tank. A collapsing currency is a death sentence for a country that imports its food and technology. It leads to hyperinflation of essential goods. So, the Bank of Canada has to choose. Crash the housing market and the banks, or crash the currency and the standard of living. Most likely, they will try to walk the middle path, which means they will fail at both. They will cut rates slightly, but not enough to save the homeowners, yet enough to keep inflation sticky and the currency weak. It is the worst of both worlds. The tragedy of this situation is the human cost. We are witnessing the destruction of a generation. The social contract in Canada was simple. Work hard, get an education, and you can afford a decent life in a safe city. That contract has been torn up and set on fire. A young person graduating from a Canadian university today faces a tax rate that takes half their income, a cost of living that makes saving impossible, and a housing market where a starter home costs $1 million. They are looking at the math and realizing the game is rigged. This is fueling a brain drain. The best and brightest young Canadians are leaving. They are moving to the United States, to Dubai, to anywhere where hard work is actually rewarded. Doctors, engineers, and tech workers are fleeing south. Who can blame them? In Texas, they can double their salary and buy a house for a third of the price. What remains in Canada is a population of asset holders, boomers, and asset servers, immigrants and the young. It is a neo-feudal structure, the landed gentry and the serfs. But even the landed gentry are not safe. Many boomers are relying on their home equity to fund their retirement. They think they are millionaires because their bungalow in the suburbs is worth $1.5 million. But wealth is only real if you can liquidate it. If everyone tries to sell at once to fund their retirement, who is the buyer? The young have no money. The immigrants are tapping out. The foreign investors are leaving because the market is falling. The liquidity is drying up. The hypothetical millions are about to evaporate. This is why the Canadian crash will be worse than 2008 in the US. In the US, many states had non-recourse mortgages. If you walked away from your house, the bank took the keys, and that was it. You ruined your credit, but you didn't owe the money anymore. In Canada, mortgages are full recourse in most provinces. If you walk away from your house, the bank sells it. If the house sells for less than the mortgage, you still owe the difference. The bank can come after your wages, your other assets, your future. You cannot just walk away. You are an indentured servant to the debt. This means Canadians will fight tooth and nail to keep their homes. They will cut spending on everything else. They will stop eating out. They will stop buying clothes. They will cancel subscriptions. The entire consumption economy will grind to a halt as people pour every available dollar into the black hole of their mortgage. This creates a zombie economy, a nation of house-poor slaves working just to pay interest to the banks. The warning signs are flashing red everywhere. Corporate insolvencies are spiking. Credit card delinquency is rising. Auto loan defaults are up. Productivity is falling. The standard of living is declining at the fastest rate in 40 years. Canada is a case study in what happens when a country prioritizes asset bubbles over productive growth. It is what happens when you let politicians choose the easy path of debt and immigration over the hard path of innovation and investment. The party is over. The bill has arrived. And the sad truth is, Canada is broke. The Canada is stable narrative was a luxury of the low interest rate era. Now that money has a cost again, the illusions are being stripped away. We are seeing the country for what it really is. A resource economy that stopped developing its resources, a manufacturing economy that stopped manufacturing, and a knowledge economy that priced out its own knowledge workers. All that is left is the real estate. And the real estate is a bubble looking for a pin. The irony is palpable. In 2008, Canadian leaders smugly lectured the Americans on prudent financial management. But the Americans took their medicine. They deleveraged. They fixed their balance sheets. It was painful, but they healed. Canada refused the medicine. They doubled down on the disease. And now the sickness is terminal. As we move through the next 24 months, watch the Canadian banking sector. Watch the private mortgage lenders. Watch the currency. The unraveling will start at the edges, in the private lending space, in the pre-construction condo market, and then it will move to the center. The government will try to bail everyone out. They will print money. They will offer 40-year mortgages. They will buy mortgage bonds. But you cannot solve a debt crisis with more debt. You cannot solve a solvency crisis with liquidity. The Canadian housing bubble is not just a market cycle. It is the end of an economic era. The Maple Leaf Miracle was a mirage fueled by cheap credit and dirty money. Now, the wind has changed, the sand is blowing away, and we're about to see what lies beneath. It isn't going to be polite. The implications for the global economy are significant, but the implications for the Canadian people are tragic. A generation has been sacrificed on the altar of high home prices. The social cohesion of the country is fraying. The division between the haves, property owners, and the have-nots, renters, is becoming the defining political fault line. We are already seeing the political shifts. The anger is palpable. The sunny ways of the current administration have turned into dark, stormy resentment. But no politician, from the left or the right, has a solution that doesn't involve pain. To fix housing affordability, prices must crash. If prices crash, the economy collapses and the boomers lose their retirement. If prices don't crash, the young revolt in the economy dies a slow death of stagnation. There is no good door to walk through. The world should take note. Canada is the first of the untouchable housing bubbles to crack, but it won't be the last. Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Europe followed similar playbooks. But Canada went the furthest, the fastest. So, when you see the headlines in the coming year about Canadian bank losses, or currency crisis in Ottawa, or mass defaults in Toronto, don't be surprised. Don't let them tell you nobody could have seen this coming. The data was there. The warnings were there. The history books told us exactly how this story ends. Bubbles always burst. No country is special. No market is immune to gravity. Canada thought it could defy the laws of economics forever. It thought it had found a cheat code, just sell houses to each other and get rich. But the game is over, the screen is flashing red, and there are no extra lives left.